Inside, the fire cracked low, and the man who sat beside it moved little. His name was Eli Hollard, though no one had spoken it aloud in nearly 6 months. He didn't need names anymore. Not out here. Just wood, water, and enough bread to keep the ache in his stomach at a dull whisper. He'd once been known in 3 states, for what depended on who you asked, but time had whittled his legend down to the rasp of a cane on pinewood floors, a limp that marked winter coming before the clouds ever did. He'd spent that day splitting logs, hands wrapped in old leather, jaw set. There was comfort in the swing of an axe. It didn't ask questions. Didn't care what you'd done or what haunted your sleep. By twilight, he was back in the chair by the hearth, boots drying, stew warming, and the wind just starting to sing against the boards. He had no plans beyond enduring. That's when the knock came. 3 of them. Not frantic. Not polite. Just hollow, like someone who wasn't sure the door would open. Eli didn't move right away. The knock had been swallowed by snow, barely louder than the pop of pine in the flame. But something in his chest stirred. Not alarm, exactly. A memory, maybe. An echo of the old days when trouble wore a smile and waited for you to answer. He rose slow. Took the rifle from beside the window. Didn't load it. Didn't need to. Trouble came loaded on its own. When he opened the door, the cold bit deep, and so did the sight before him. A woman stood there, swaying on her feet, her shawl clutched around her like it was the only thing keeping her stitched together. Her hair was dark, plastered to her cheeks by snow and sweat. Her dress was wrong for the season, wrong for the terrain. And in her arms, barely covered, barely moving, was a baby. She opened her mouth. A single word came out, soft and breathless. Please. Then she dropped. Eli caught her before she hit the floor. Not out of instinct, not out of kindness, just something older than both. Something that spoke of duty without reward. The baby slipped from her arms into his, wrapped in a too-thin blanket. It didn't cry. Just blinked up at him, eyes wide and wet like they hadn't yet decided whether to trust the world or not. He carried them both inside. Laid her near the fire. Put the child in the cradle that hadn't rocked in years. The stew burned. He didn't notice. Hours passed like that. She didn't wake. The child slept. Eli worked in silence, boiling water, cleaning the cut on her hand, hanging her wet clothes near the fire. She had no ring. No belongings. Just a ribbon in her pocket and a bruise on her temple the shape of a man's boot heel. The snow thickened. The wind howled. Still, no word came from her lips. He didn't ask questions. Just made a place for her in the silence. By nightfall, she stirred. Eyes fluttered. She turned her head and winced. "You're safe," he said simply, voice like gravel. "For now." She tried to sit. Couldn't. Her gaze found the baby, then him. Panic flared, but it passed. You're alone out here?" Her voice was hoarse, unused. "Always have been." She swallowed. Her hands gripped the blanket like it might dissolve. "They're coming. I don't know how long." "Who?" She looked away. "People who think they can take what don't belong to them." He nodded once. Didn't press. She wasn't ready. You could see it in the way her body curled in, protecting something too new, too raw. "Your child?" he asked, more gently. She hesitated, then looked at the fire. "Yes." She didn't say more. He didn't need her to. The way she said it, the ache in that one syllable, said enough. He brought her broth. She drank it without thanks, as if unsure she deserved it. Later, as the logs burned low and the baby whimpered, she whispered a name. Samson. Eli noted it but said nothing. When the baby cried, she rose on unsteady legs, arms open without thought. She cradled the boy, sang a song under her breath, one of those lullabies that sounded more like mourning than comfort. Eli sat and watched, not intruding, just listening. He saw the tremble in her shoulders, the way she watched the window like it might break open any moment. Her fear was quiet, but it ran deep, like a spring under ice. "You're welcome to stay the night," he said finally. "Cabin's old, but it keeps the cold out." She didn't answer right away. Then she nodded, once, and pulled the child closer. That was all. No thank you. No questions. Just survival in its plainest form. He watched her settle by the fire. She kept the child close, eyes open long after they should have closed. Eli returned to his chair, back creaking, joints murmuring their complaints. He stirred the fire. The coals glowed like eyes in the dark. Outside, the storm thickened. Branches groaned. An owl called once, then went silent. Inside, the cabin held its breath. He didn't sleep. Not really. Just sat, half dreaming, half listening, watching the woman and child wrapped together in his old blanket, curled in the corner like forgotten hope. His thoughts wandered, to younger days, to a woman with red hair and a crooked laugh, long gone now. To a time when a child's cry didn't feel like a memory he'd misplaced. When the baby stirred and fussed, the woman was there in an instant. The way her hand cupped the boy's cheek, it wasn't just maternal. It was protective. Like she expected someone to snatch him away at any moment. Like she'd already lost something once, and wouldn't survive losing again. Eli turned his eyes to the flames. There were things in this world no law could fix. And there were wounds that didn't bleed until years later, when the world got quiet enough to hear them breaking. Near dawn, she spoke again, voice barely louder than breath. "Why'd you open the door?" He looked over. Her eyes caught his, tired but searching. He thought about lying. Thought about saying something clean and clear. Instead, he said, "Didn't know I'd locked it." She held his gaze for a long moment, then gave the smallest smile, not of joy, but understanding. Outside, the storm began to break. The sky lightened, slow and pale. Snow clung to the window panes like frozen lace. Eli rose, his bones protesting. He poured 2 cups of coffee, strong and black. Brought one to her. She accepted it wordlessly. They drank in silence. Something had shifted. Not in words. Not in gesture. Just a thread drawn between them. Thin, fragile, but real. He didn't ask what she was running from. Not yet. But the knock had come. The door had opened. And nothing in that quiet world would be the same again. The morning came slow, like an old man easing into a chair. Pale light crept between the slats and the shutters, falling in ribbons across the cabin floor. The fire had sunk into coals, red and pulsing like the heart of something ancient. Eli Hollard stood at the hearth, stoking the embers with the same patience he used to saddle horses in the dark or tie splints on a broken leg. Some tasks didn't need thought, just rhythm. Behind him, the woman and the baby still slept. Or maybe not. She'd hardly moved in hours, but her breathing had deepened and evened, and she no longer clutched the child with a hand clenched in fear. She lay curled beneath one of his old patchwork quilts, and the baby, Samson, she'd said, was bundled close to her chest, the way a soul hangs on to a body it doesn't yet trust. Eli poured water from the kettle into 2 tin cups. The smell of scorched pine hung in the room, thick and sharp, but beneath it was something warmer. Survival, maybe. The kind that settled deep in your bones and didn't leave room for conversation. She stirred. A groan, barely audible. Her eyes fluttered open, slow and glassy with fatigue, as though waking itself cost her something. He handed her the cup wordlessly. She took it with a nod, fingers trembling. Sipped. Then blinked twice, registering the warmth. Her voice cracked the silence like dry bark. "It's morning." He glanced out the window. "Seems like." A pause. Then, "You kept us safe." "I kept the fire going," he replied. "The rest is yours." She looked down at the baby, nestled and dreaming. Her lips twitched like they wanted to smile but remembered too much. He didn't cry once. He was too tired. Or too smart. Eli leaned against the mantel. He knows when quiet's safer than noise. Her jaw set at that. He's had to learn too much too early. You both have. She met his eyes then, truly looked. There was a flicker of recognition. Not of him, not yet, but of the shape he took in her storm. A man not running toward her, not away. Just steady, present. That, perhaps, was the rarest thing of all. "My name's Mary," she said. He didn't answer right away. Just nodded. Then, Eli. The names sat between them like coins on a table, worn, weathered, exchanged in silence. She tried to rise but winced. Her ankle had swollen overnight. Purple and angry, it peeked from beneath the hem of her skirt like a secret come to light. Eli reached for the cane leaning by the wall. "Best not to walk on it. I've got poultice and wrap. It won't fix it, but it'll quiet it down." "I can't stay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "You'll stay long enough to heal." Mary said nothing, but she didn't argue again. Eli fetched the salve and bandage from a wooden box carved with initials that didn't match his own. As he wrapped her foot, she gritted her teeth but didn't cry out. He noticed her palms were scraped raw, as if she'd fallen more than once on her way to the door. She hadn't run far, but she'd run hard. When he finished, he pulled the blanket up over her knees and took a step back, studying her in the firelight. "You got people?" "No," she said, then hesitated. "I mean, maybe once. But they didn't come for me. Not when it started." "And when was that?" She looked at the baby, her voice dropping. "When I told the truth." Eli didn't press. He knew how heavy truth could be. How sometimes it followed you like a second shadow. The hours passed slowly. Mary drifted in and out of sleep. The baby nursed, fussed, napped. Eli boiled lentils and dried beef in the stew pot, letting the scent rise and fill the room. It was the kind of food you made when the larder was half empty but a man still had his dignity. He handed her a bowl near noon. She took it with both hands, greedily at first, then stopped herself. "I don't mean to be rude." "You're hungry," he said. "That's not rude. That's just living." "I haven't eaten since." Her voice trailed off, the words slipping between teeth like spilled salt. "Since yesterday, I think." "That ain't long." "Not for some," she said, a dark humor flickering. "But for a mother, it's a lifetime." The way she said it, fierce, raw, laced with apology and defiance, made Eli quiet. He knew women like her were often judged by their silence or their shouting, never by their scars. The stew disappeared in minutes. Samson cooed from the cradle, stretching like a cat in sunlight. His hands made tiny fists, then opened again, trusting the air around him. "His father's not coming for him," Mary said suddenly. Eli looked up. "I thought he might," she went on. "That first week. Thought maybe I'd hear him on the wind or see his boots in the snow. But he's not that kind of man." "What kind is he?" "The kind who thinks he owns what he touches. Who calls taking, protecting. Who loves like it's a ledger to be settled." Her eyes glinted. He didn't want a son. He wanted an heir. Eli stirred the fire with the poker, watching sparks climb into the chimney. "And you?" "I wanted a child who wouldn't grow up afraid of his own father." She paused. "I guess I failed at that, at least for a while." "You ran," Eli said. "That ain't failure. That's survival." Her lips parted like she might say more, but instead she just held her hands out to the fire. They were shaking again. He wondered how long she'd been carrying it all. Fear, exhaustion, guilt, without letting it spill. The cabin's walls creaked under the weight of wind. Outside, the snow softened everything, even time. Inside, the quiet grew warmer. After the meal, she let him take the child while she lay down proper, her head resting on a pillow that still smelled faintly of cedar and pipe smoke. Eli cradled the boy with surprising ease. It had been decades since he'd held anything so fragile. But some instincts don't rust. They just wait. Samson stared at him with grave, curious eyes. Not afraid. Not smiling. Just watching. "You're too young to carry all that weight," Eli murmured. "Let your mother carry it a while longer. She's earned it." The baby blinked. He rocked him gently, walking the edge of the room, careful not to step too hard. He didn't think about what he looked like, a grizzled man with a bad knee and blood on his name, holding a child like it was the last soft thing in the world. He just walked. And the baby drifted off. Later, as dusk returned and the fire grew bold again, Mary sat up and spoke into the quiet. "Why are you alone?" Eli took his time answering. "I thought I'd done enough in the world. Figured I'd give the rest of it back to itself." "That's not really an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She waited. When he didn't elaborate, she nodded to herself. "I used to ask questions like that. Before I knew not all stories are owed." He watched her for a long beat. "You still believe in right and wrong?" "I believe in what a child becomes when he sees too much of the wrong." "That's more belief than most." She wrapped the quilt tighter. Her hair had dried into loose curls that fell over her shoulder. Her face, though tired, no longer looked hunted. Just cautious. Like a tree still standing after a storm, bark stripped but roots deep. That night, she didn't ask to leave. She sat with him near the fire, rocking the baby while Eli cleaned his rifle out of habit, though he hadn't fired it in years. "You any good with that?" she asked. "I used to be. And now?" He looked at her, then at the child. "Now I'm good at knowing when not to reach for it." She smiled, just barely. It didn't light her face, but it softened it. In the hours that followed, they said little. But it wasn't silence anymore. It was rest. That thin place between fear and trust where a person decides which way they're leaning. When she finally lay down again, she didn't flinch at the creak of the cabin, didn't jolt at the wind howling through the stovepipe. She slept like someone who had one foot out of the nightmare. Eli didn't sleep, not fully. But when the child stirred and whimpered in the cradle, he rose before Mary could. He soothed the boy with a single touch, light as snowfall. Outside, the clouds cleared. Stars blinked into view like forgotten prayers. He stood by the window a while, cane in hand, watching the woods. A woman and her child had come to his door with nothing but breath and bruises. And still, somehow, they had brought warmth. He felt the old ache again, low and familiar. Regret, maybe. Or something stranger. Hope. He didn't know what would come next. But for tonight, he knew this. He'd opened the door once. And now, he would not close it again. The snowstorm lasted 2 more days, blanketing the world in a silence too heavy for even the wind to lift. The pines outside groaned beneath their burden, branches bowed like penitents in prayer. Inside the cabin, time slowed. The hours passed not by clocks or light, but by the rhythm of firewood and the sighs of a sleeping child. Samson grew quieter, his cries softening into coos, his body learning the shape of peace. And Mary, she changed too. Not suddenly, not loudly, but in small, noticeable ways. Her hands stopped trembling. Her gaze, once tethered to every shadow, now lingered longer in the warmth. The deep grooves of dread in her face eased by degrees. Eli saw it. He noticed everything. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when listening. How she tilted her head slightly to hear better when Samson whimpered. She smiled once at a crooked bird call outside, just once, and it startled even her. It startled him too, though he didn't let it show. He was a man long trained to notice cracks in silence and never comment on them. But still, he saw. They hadn't spoken much the first day. But words, like thawing rivers, find their path when the earth warms. It was the second night by the fire when she asked, in a voice low and even, "Do you think people are born bad?" Eli had just sat down with his pipe, which he no longer lit, only held out of habit. He looked up, met her eyes. They were calm now, but beneath them swam a tiredness older than her years. "No," he said after a moment. "But I think some folk get broken early, and never stop cutting others just to feel whole." She nodded, like she already knew, like she just needed to hear it from someone else's mouth. "My husband," she said slowly, "was never cruel when others were watching. Always polite, always clean. Knew the words to make folks smile, and the quiet threats that kept me from speaking. Eli didn't flinch. Just listened. He married me when I was 17. My folks thought it was a kindness. Thought I was lucky. A man with land, cattle, and a barn roof that didn't leak. She paused. I didn't know what luck meant then. He waited. I lost our first child. Her voice cracked like ice. He said it was my fault. That I didn't love it right. That maybe it hadn't even been his. After that, he stopped saying things. Just started showing them. She took a long breath. The firelight danced over her features, gilding them in flickers of gold. I wasn't allowed to leave the house without him. Couldn't write letters. Couldn't cry too loudly. He wanted obedience dressed up like devotion. Her eyes narrowed, steady. So I gave it to him. Until I couldn't anymore. Eli leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees. What changed? Her hand found Samson's tiny foot beneath the blanket. This one. He changed everything. He your husband's? No, she said almost defiantly. No, he's not. He didn't ask who the father was. It didn't matter. Blood was never what made someone yours. It was what you gave up to protect them that told the truth. Mary traced circles on the baby's blanket. When I told him I was pregnant, he laughed. Said he'd get rid of it if I didn't. I ran that night. Stole a mule and a sack of apples. I don't even remember the first 10 miles. How far behind are they? Eli asked. They weren't chasing me. Not then. Her voice dimmed. But 2 weeks ago, I saw a rider at the edge of town where I'd holed up. He wore a star. Said he had a warrant. For me. What for? She swallowed. Said I poisoned my husband. That I left him choking in bed and took his child like a thief in the night. Eli's brow furrowed, slow and deep. Is he dead? I don't know, she whispered. I didn't wait to find out. He nodded. You don't carry the guilt of a killer. You carry something heavier. Her eyes snapped to his. What do you mean? Regret. The kind that comes from doing what's right, but wishing the world were kinder about it. She sat back, stunned by the precision of it. Then nodded, tears welling but not falling. I wanted to believe I could disappear. Just be a mother somewhere. Keep my head down. But the world's too small and men like him got long arms. Eli looked into the fire. You're not wrong. They didn't speak again for a long time. The flames filled the space where words might have gone. Samson made small sleeping sounds, like dreams were passing through him in whispers. When the clock marked midnight with a single groan, Eli stirred. There's a place west of here. Red Bluff. My cousin's got a farm there. They mind their own business. You think she'd take us in? She took me in once when I didn't deserve it. I reckon she'd do the same for someone who does. Mary didn't speak, but her eyes shone with something close to hope. Close enough. The next day, the weather began to shift. The sky grew clearer, the snow slackened. The world beyond the window came back into shape. No longer a blanket of white, but a place again. With distance. With danger. Eli chopped wood in the morning while Mary bundled Samson in one of his old flannel shirts, sleeves pinned with twine. She laughed when he wriggled, high and soft, and the sound startled her. She put her hand to her mouth like she didn't trust it. I can leave soon, she said that night. You've done more than enough. You won't get far on that foot. And not with a child in arms. I can't stay either. He didn't argue. Instead, he handed her a map, hand-drawn and faded. There's a trail here. Hidden mostly. Cuts between the ridges. Safer. She took it like it was scripture. Why are you helping me? She asked. Eli didn't look at her right away. He stared into the dark woods beyond the window. Because once, someone helped me. And I was too proud to say thank you before they were gone. She nodded, understanding in her silence. Later, she found him at the edge of the porch, staring into the dusk. Eli, she said. "Can I ask something?" "Of course. Did you ever have a family?" He closed his eyes for a moment, let the past drift up like smoke. "I had a brother. He died in a duel that wasn't his. I had a woman. She left before I could." Mary waited. "I've had chances," he said. "Wasted most of them. Spent the rest hiding from what I wasted. I don't think you're hiding now." He glanced at her, the edges of his mouth twitching. "Neither are you." That night, as the wind quieted and the fire died down, Mary told him one last truth. "I killed a man," she said softly. "Eli didn't move. He wasn't my husband. He was a deputy. The one who found me 2 towns back. Said he had orders to take the boy. That if I ran, he'd put us both in the ground." She looked down at her hands, as if the memory still stained them. "I had a knife. I didn't think. I just moved. He bled fast. I ran." Eli exhaled slowly. "Sounds like self-defense." "Doesn't matter what it sounds like," she said. "Not out here." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She rose and walked to the cradle, touched the boy's cheek with trembling fingers. "That's why I came to your door. I was ready to die. I just didn't want him to." Eli's voice was barely a whisper. "And now," she turned, "now I want to live, even if it's just one more day." They stood there in the hush of near morning. Neither spoke again. But in the silence, something passed between them. A recognition not born of pity or romance, but of kinship. 2 people bent but not broken. 2 ghosts trying to become flesh again. When she went to sleep, she didn't stir at every crack or creak. And when Eli took first watch by the window, he did so with his hand near the rifle, not out of fear but readiness. Because now he knew what she carried, and she knew what he'd chosen to carry with her. What neither of them knew, what neither of them could yet name, was the fact that dawn would not come gently. Something was already riding toward them. But for now, they had this. A name spoken without shame. A nightmare survived. And the quiet before the fire burned hotter than it had in years. The wind changed that morning. Eli noticed it before the sun rose. A sharpness in the air, a break in the quiet that no birdsong could explain. The snow had thinned overnight, crusting to ice near the trees, and in the stillness of dawn, every creak and shift of pine needles came through clearer than it should have. He stood on the porch with his coat pulled tight, eyes scanning the tree line as if the horizon itself were breathing different. He didn't like it. Inside, Mary was stirring. She'd slept heavier than usual. The lines around her eyes softened. Her ankle was better, though still wrapped, and she could walk now without wincing every step. Samson was in her arms, gnawing softly at the corner of a cloth. The way she moved about the cabin had changed, not just in steps, but in spirit. She no longer looked like someone hiding. She looked like someone waiting. And Eli knew waiting came in many forms. Some were hopeful. Some were doomed. He stepped back inside, closed the door behind him, and leaned the rifle against the frame. "You feel it?" he asked. Mary glanced up. "The quiet." He nodded. "Yes," she said. "Feels like something's holding its breath." He ladled water into the kettle, put it over the fire. Storm's gone. Sky's too clear now. She sat near the hearth, her fingers brushing Samson's cheek. "That's when they ride." He didn't ask how she knew. He didn't need to. When a person's been hunted long enough, they learn the shape of pursuit, even in sleep. She didn't speak much through breakfast. Neither did he. They moved with the same kind of hush a household uses after a death but before the funeral, where the silence isn't mourning, it's preparation. The first sound came near noon. Hooves. 5, maybe 6 horses. Not galloping, but not lazy either. Eli rose from the table and walked to the window, peeled back the curtain a finger's width. "They're coming up the ridge now," he said. Mary stood slowly, cradling Samson tighter. "Sheriff." "Not sure yet." He took his time pulling the revolver from the mantel. The thing was oiled and clean. Loaded. Hadn't fired a round in years, but it fit his hand like memory. Mary backed into the far corner of the room, clutching the baby as if she could fold herself into the walls. Her mouth was dry. Her knuckles white. "Do I run?" she asked. Eli didn't answer right away. Then quiet. "You could. But they'd find your tracks easy in that snow. What if they want a fight?" He looked down at the revolver. Then at her. "Then we decide if it's worth giving them one." The hoofbeats stopped. Silence stretched thin, like wire pulled tight between poles. Then came the knock. It wasn't gentle. Eli opened the door. 5 men stood before him. Dusty, weather-worn, broad in shoulder and narrow in sole. One wore a tin star pinned crooked to his coat. His boots were polished but muddy. He had a face built for sneering. "Afternoon," the sheriff said. Eli leaned against the doorframe, calm as you please. "Depends how this goes." The sheriff smiled with no warmth. "You got guests?" Eli didn't blink. "I might." "Well, see, we're looking for a woman. Took off with another man's child. There's a warrant for her. You got papers?" The sheriff sniffed. "Don't need 'em in cases like this. Whole town knows what she did." Eli's eyes didn't waver. "I don't live in your town." The posse shifted behind the sheriff. One man spat into the snow. Another adjusted the strap of his rifle. "Mind if we take a look inside?" the sheriff asked. "I do mind," Eli said. "Now listen." "No. You listen. This here's my land. My home. You don't step in without cause. And cause don't mean gossip from men who beat their wives and bury their conscience in coin." The smile dropped. "You harboring her?" "I'm harboring a mother with bruises and a child with no name but what she gave him. She killed her husband. She ran. Might have saved both their lives doing it." The sheriff stepped forward. "She's a fugitive. That makes you an accessory." Eli stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him with one quiet hand. "You want to take her, you'll need to step through me." The men bristled. The one on the left reached for his holster. Eli's gaze flicked to him, and that was enough. The man froze. "You know who I am?" Eli asked softly. The sheriff's lip curled. "I know you're a cripple with a past. You used to be fast. Don't mean much now." Eli looked out at the snow-covered ridge, at the stillness of the trees. "No," he said. "Don't mean much now. But I'm still standing, and you're still talking, so maybe you think I'm something worth fearing." The sheriff didn't answer, but one of the younger men behind him shifted, glanced to the side, as if rethinking things. "We'll be back," the sheriff muttered. "With papers." "You do that," Eli said. "But next time, knock with manners." They left. The hoofbeats trailed off into the trees, angry and uncertain. Eli stayed on the porch until he couldn't hear them anymore. Then he stepped back inside, closing the door slowly. Mary was standing where he left her. Her eyes were wide but dry. Samson was asleep against her chest. "You didn't let them in," she said. "They weren't asking." She walked to him, slow. "They'll come back. I know. And you'll still be here?" "I'll still be here." Something passed in that moment between them, stronger than fear, older than doubt. Not love. Not yet. But the bones of it. The promise of shelter that didn't have to be spoken to be true. That night, they sat at the table long after the fire burned down low. Eli cleaned the revolver in silence while Mary fed the baby. Neither mentioned the men. Neither spoke of tomorrow. But both were thinking it. When she finally rose to put Samson down, she turned back and asked, "Would you really have fought them?" Eli didn't look up. "Yes. Even if it meant killing? If it meant protecting what's right? Yes." Mary crossed the floor and laid a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't even know me 3 days ago." I didn't have to. He said it without pride, without flourish. Just the way you say the sky is blue when you're looking at it, or that fire burns when you touch it. She left him with that, and went to sleep in the far room, door cracked open. Eli sat a while longer. Outside, the moon glared down silver and hard. The wind had gone quiet again. Not gone, just holding still. He knew the sheriff would return. And next time, he'd bring more than judgment. He'd bring the law, or what passed for it in places where power bought the truth. Eli stood and walked to the door. He leaned his head against it, eyes closed. The baby's soft breathing echoed from the room behind him. A sound so small, so full of life it made the stillness of the world feel enormous. He hadn't known why he'd opened the door that night. But now he did. Because some doors, once opened, aren't meant to close. Not when there's still something good left to guard behind them. The dawn rose pale and watchful, as if the sky itself hesitated to turn the page. Eli Hollard stood at the edge of the woods, coat drawn tight, his breath clouding in the stillness. His hand rested lightly on the revolver at his hip, not clenched, not itching, just familiar, like a tool a craftsman knew too well to fear. Snow clung in the creases of his boots. Beneath it, frozen earth held the weight of what was coming. Behind him, the cabin remained quiet. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney, defiant and fragile. Inside, Mary fed Samson, her hand steady, her face unreadable. She hadn't asked him for a plan. She'd only said, when the first frostlight spilled across the windows, "You don't have to stay." And Eli, standing in the doorway with the morning on his shoulders, had looked at her and answered, "I do." Because it wasn't about debt. It wasn't about guilt or old sins in need of balancing. It was about choosing to be the kind of man who doesn't walk away when something worth protecting finally finds him. He hadn't always been that man. But he would be today. He walked the perimeter of the cabin twice, slowly, noting the ridgelines, the blind spots between trees. He'd pulled the rifle from above the mantel last night and cleaned it until it gleamed. Loaded and checked it twice. Not because he longed for blood, but because the world had drawn its line, and he intended to be on the right side of it this time. By midday, the wind shifted. The sound of hooves came like a slow roll of thunder, measured, deliberate, not the reckless gallop of bandits or the scattered clatter of cowhands. This was a procession. A message. Eli stood in the yard, coat open, hat low. His stance loose but grounded. A tree wouldn't move, and neither would he. 7 riders crested the hill. The sheriff was at the center. A legal paper fluttered in his hand, likely unread and unnecessary. His eyes burned with the satisfaction of a man who believed himself inevitable. "Eli Hollard," he called, voice curling across the snow. "By order of the county seat, we're here to collect the woman and the child. She's to stand trial. And the boy." "You're not touching that child," Eli said. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They were iron dropped into still water. The sheriff smiled thinly. "You gonna make this hard?" "I'm gonna make it honest." One of the deputies shifted in the saddle, the youngest of them, no more than 20. His jaw twitched. He didn't meet Eli's eyes. The sheriff dismounted slowly, stepping into the snow like he owned it. "You're harboring a criminal. That's aiding and abetting. You'll be arrested alongside her." "You call her a criminal," Eli said, "but I see a woman who ran to save her son. I see a man who's worn that badge too long without knowing what it means." "You trying to play judge now?" "I've been judged before," Eli said, stepping forward. "It cost me everything. So I learned to judge careful. Learned what justice looks like. It doesn't look like you. You always had a mouth on you. You always had a weak spine," Eli replied calmly. The sheriff's smile cracked. "Last chance, Hollard. Move aside." Eli didn't. So the sheriff nodded. The men drew their weapons. And from the cabin door, a voice rang out. "No." Mary stood in the threshold, snow drifting at her feet. Her hair was braided back, her eyes bright with clarity. Samson was not in her arms. He was hidden, safe in the cellar beneath the hearth, where Eli had carved a hollow space long ago, never knowing who it might one day shelter. She walked out, slow, each step measured, wrapped in Eli's old coat. "You want me," she said. "Then take me." The sheriff blinked, off balance. "You giving yourself up?" "I'm telling you one thing," she said, her voice like the edge of a blade dulled by mercy. "This boy is not yours to take. He's not his father's. He's mine. And I will not let another man write the end of my story." "You think I won't shoot you here?" the sheriff asked. "I think you want it clean," she said. "And there's nothing clean about killing an unarmed woman in front of a man who knows how to shoot straighter than you." The sheriff raised his hand. And then Eli stepped between them. "You won't touch her," he said. The men hesitated. One raised his rifle. And then Eli's hand moved. Not fast. Not sudden. Just with the kind of certainty that makes men hesitate too long. One shot. The rifle flew from the deputy's hands, clattered to the snow. He fell back, yelping more in shock than pain. "Next one aims, he loses more than his weapon," Eli said. They didn't move. The sheriff's face had gone pale. "You'll hang for this." Eli looked him in the eye. "Maybe. But you'll bleed first." A silence deeper than snow settled over them. Cold, wide, eternal. Then the young deputy, the one with the twitching jaw, spoke. "This ain't justice," he said quietly. "This ain't what I signed on for." The sheriff whipped around. "Don't you speak." "I won't follow a man who lies to shoot a mother," the boy said, voice steady now. "You want to drag them out, do it yourself." He turned his horse. The crunch of hooves in snow rang like thunder. Then another man followed. Then another. The sheriff stood, alone now, mouth open like a man betrayed by his own reflection. Eli lowered his revolver. "Go home," he said. "Write your report. Say you found nothing. Say whatever lets you sleep. But don't come back here." The sheriff looked at Mary. Then at Eli. Then he turned. And walked. When the last hoofbeat vanished into the trees, Eli holstered his revolver. Mary stood frozen, chest rising and falling like a bellows. Eli turned to her. "You all right?" She nodded, barely. "He's safe. Still sleeping. Didn't hear a thing." She walked forward, wrapped her arms around him without thinking. And for a moment, he didn't breathe. Then he did. Slowly. Deeply, as if he hadn't in years. They stood that way until the cold bit through the moment and pushed them back inside. The fire had gone to embers. Eli added wood without speaking. Mary knelt beside the hearth and lifted the panel, pulling Samson gently from the hollow. The boy blinked, stretched, then curled against her like he'd only just remembered she was real. Eli sat across from them, watching the two of them with a gaze that said more than words could reach. "You ever think about leaving?" Mary asked softly, rocking the child. "I did," Eli said. "Thought maybe I'd head west. Find the edge again. And now." He leaned back, the chair creaking. "Now I think maybe the edge came to me." She looked up. "What if they come back?" He met her eyes. "Then we face it. Together." There was no ceremony to it. No confession. Just a quiet understanding, born in fire and tested in snow. Later, they sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the sun begin to fall. Samson cooed in his sleep, safe against her shoulder. Mary looked at the horizon. "I spent a long time trying to be small, to be forgettable. But I don't want that anymore." "You don't have to be," Eli said. "I don't think you were ever forgettable." He smiled, slow and warm. "Maybe not," he said. "But I think this is the first time I've been remembered for the right reasons." She leaned her head against his arm. The wind passed softly through the pines. The snow sparkled like silver dust. Behind them, the cabin stood quiet. A place of blood, of battle, of redemption. And for the first time in a long time, Eli Hollard felt no ghosts stirring inside it. Just the living. Just the now. And a peace earned one choice at a time. The past hadn't vanished. But it had quieted. And for the wounded gunslinger and the widow who wouldn't be hunted anymore, that was enough. Sophie's fingers, raw and chapped from days of hauling firewood, moved with the same calm as always. The calm of a woman who had long ago stopped waiting for anything to change. She wrapped a wool shawl tighter over her shoulders, the fabric still smelling faintly of pine and smoke. Her eyes, once called wild with amber light by a man now buried under snow, were dulled with weight, not of sorrow alone, but of too many mornings just like this one. Elsie was still asleep in the loft, curled beneath the quilt Sophie had made from her wedding dress. The girl was 12 and quiet in ways most children were not. She had her father's high cheekbones and her mother's watchful gaze, though she rarely looked anyone in the eye. Since Stephen died, she had not asked much, not even about the blood. Children understand more than grown folk like to admit, and Elsie, small as she was, understood death the way birds know the coming of storms. The kettle rattled softly on the stove, and Sophie poured tea into a chipped mug. She did not sit to drink it. She rarely did. Her gaze drifted to the mantel, where a faded daguerreotype stood. Stephen McKenna, tall and strong-shouldered, in a stiff suit and a stare sharp as fence wire. People in town still called him a good man. Brave. A provider. Sophie remembered him as a man with calloused hands and louder boots than necessary. A man who mistook possession for protection. They had buried him 8 months ago, after a shootout with Comanche riders not 3 miles from the homestead. The story said they came for cattle. Stephen had tried to fend them off, rifle in hand, roaring curses across the snow. They shot him clean through the chest. The others had ridden off, leaving him dead beside the broken fence line and a spooked mule. The preacher called him a martyr. Sophie had not cried. She set her cup down and stepped into her boots, pulling on her husband's old coat, the one with the split seam and the scent of gun oil in its lining. She was halfway to the coop, checking the hens, when she noticed the trail. Just beyond the frost-rimmed gate, in the untouched snow along the creek, something dark streaked through the whiteness like ink on parchment. Blood. Fresh. Sophie crouched beside it, her heart tightening as she followed the droplets upstream. They were irregular, smudged in places where something, or someone, had stumbled. The tracks were broad, dragging. Whatever it was wounded and large. Her hand hovered over the pistol tucked into her belt. Wolves didn't bleed like this. And bears wouldn't drag their feet. Her breath caught on the edges of a memory. Stephen's blood steaming in the snow, bright as berries. The trail led into the trees, down a slope where the wind whistled mournful through brittle branches. She moved slow, boots crunching softly, rifle slung low. Every instinct told her to turn back, to fetch help. But help was 3 miles of snow and judgment away. And the last time she'd asked for it, she'd been handed a sermon and a sack of salt. Then she saw him. He was crumpled beneath a cottonwood, his shoulder pressed against the bark as if the tree could hold him up. His skin was copper-dark, his hair bound with sinew and braid. Blood soaked his side, the fabric of his shirt torn and stiff with frost. His eyes fluttered open at her step, but he did not move. Sophie raised her rifle. He did not flinch. He was young, no older than 20. His face, though gaunt and painted with weariness, was oddly still. Not in fear. In resignation. As if he knew she would shoot. As if he didn't much mind. She should have walked away. Should have let the snow bury him quiet and clean. But something in his stillness held her. Not defiance. Not pride. Just the silent gravity of someone too tired to lie. He exhaled, and blood bubbled at the corner of his lips. She lowered the rifle. The sled creaked beneath his weight as she dragged him toward the barn, her breath coming in cold bursts that stung her lungs. The sun was climbing now, dull and watery in the winter sky. Elsie was awake when Sophie stumbled back to the house. She stood barefoot on the porch, her eyes wide, quilt draped around her shoulders like a cape. She said nothing as her mother passed, but her gaze followed her to the barn. Inside, Sophie laid the stranger on a bed of hay and covered him with old feed sacks. She cleaned the wound with boiled water and vinegar, her hands stiff but precise. The bullet had passed through. That was lucky. He didn't make a sound as she stitched the flesh, though his jaw tensed and his eyes closed. He didn't speak a word. When she was done, she sat back and stared at him. Was he one of them? One of the riders who'd gunned down her husband? She couldn't know. His face gave nothing. He bore no marking she recognized, though Stephen used to speak of Comanche signs like a man describing demons. Wore paint, feathers, blood-red smears. But this boy wore no feathers. No symbols. Just a tattered shirt, moccasins worn to threads, and the kind of silence that said too much. She left him water and a blanket, then stepped into the cold. That evening, as the light slipped low behind the ridge, Elsie followed her mother into the kitchen. She carried the drawing she'd made that morning. 2 birds on a wire, wings outstretched. She didn't say a word. She never asked about the man in the barn. But she folded the drawing small and slipped it under the loaf of bread Sophie packed in a tin. "Take this to the barn," Sophie said gently. "Don't speak. Don't linger." Elsie nodded and went. Sophie watched her daughter walk through the snow, so small against the world, so brave in her silence. The bread would feed him for the night. But what would tomorrow ask of them? Later, Sophie stood by the window and watched the wind play over the hills, lifting drifts and scattering the ashes of her fears across the land. The barn light glowed faintly, and a hawk circled high above the trees. She thought of Stephen, how he used to boast of killing a man at 16. How he'd spoken of war as if it made a man real. She thought of the rider lying broken in her hay. How he'd not raised a hand, not said a word. And she wondered what the world might look like if men knew the strength it took not to fight. Snow kept falling, soft as memory. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and Sophie whispered to the night. Tomorrow she would learn his name. Or not. Some stories began in silence. And not all names needed saying. The barn held a cold that bit deeper than the air outside, as though the timber itself remembered suffering and refused to forget. The boy, no, the man, lay still in the loft above the old feed bins, bundled beneath tattered quilts and coarse-woven sacks. His breath came slow but steady now. The fever had broken sometime in the night. Sophie had watched over him without speaking, her hands folded, her rifle close by. He hadn't moved when she cleaned the wound again that morning, nor when she whispered to herself in half-formed prayers. He didn't wake when the rooster called or when Elsie peeked into the barn and left another piece of flatbread on a wooden crate. But his eyes opened the moment Sophie set down her basin and turned to leave. Not fully. Just a slit, dark and unreadable. She said nothing. Neither did he. For 3 days, she brought him food and water and changed the bandage. He drank without complaint, chewed each bite slowly, never more than needed. Sometimes his gaze met hers. Sometimes it drifted toward the barn rafters, as if he heard music only he could understand. He didn't speak until the 4th day. Sophie had come with fresh linens and a broth that smelled of bone and garlic. She knelt beside him, one hand checking his temperature, the other brushing damp hair from his forehead. She had just begun to lift the old bandage when his lips moved, dry and low. "Why?" The sound startled her. She paused, fingers hovering mid-air. His voice was hoarse, sun-starved, but clear. She looked down at him, her own voice unsure. "Why, what?" His eyes were open now. Not wide, not accusing. Just present. "Why help?" he murmured. "Me." Sophie sat back on her heels. Snow blew against the barn doors, a soft hiss that filled the pause between them. "I don't rightly know," she said at last. "Maybe 'cause you were bleeding to death in my woods. Maybe 'cause my daughter was watching." His brow furrowed faintly. "You knew I was Comanche." "I figured." She shifted, wrapping her arms around her knees. "Most would have left you." He closed his eyes again. "Should have." Sophie stared at him. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a fact. Like someone who'd come to expect only one kind of ending. "I didn't," she replied, and left him to finish the broth alone. That night, She sat by the stove longer than usual, sewing a tear in one of Elsie's shirts. The child was drawing again, birds, as always, this time perched on a wire strung between two trees. "What kind are those?" Sophie asked softly. Elsie shrugged. "Ones that stay, even when it snows." The answer pulled at something behind Sophie's ribs. "You took him bread," she said after a pause. Elsie nodded, not looking up. "He doesn't scare me. He should." The girl finally met her mother's gaze. "Did Daddy scare you?" Sophie's breath caught. She set the sewing down and let the silence settle thick between them. Then she stood and kissed the top of Elsie's head. "We don't talk ill of the dead," she said, though the words tasted bitter. In truth, Stephen had frightened her only once. But that once had left a bruise behind her collarbone and a silence in their marriage she never quite found her way through. It was a moment neither of them spoke about again, and it died with him, though it lived on in the way she flinched at loud voices and never raised her own. The next day, she asked the man in the barn his name. He didn't answer. Instead, he motioned weakly toward a bit of charcoal by the hay bale and pressed it into her palm. She blinked at him, confused, until he pointed at the barn wall. She knelt beside him and waited. He pulled the blanket from his shoulders and with trembling fingers etched a single word onto the wood. Savanu. She ran her fingertips over it, the name strange on her tongue. Savanu. He nodded once. "You speak some English." "Some. Enough to know what I'm saying." His mouth lifted faintly at one corner. Not a smile. A ghost of one. "Enough," he agreed. Sophie stood and tucked the charcoal into a wooden box near the door. She didn't want Elsie to see it. The child asked too many questions with her eyes. Over the next week, the barn took on a rhythm. Sophie would tend the fire, check the snares, feed the chickens, then bring Savannah food and herbs she'd dried herself, goldenrod for pain, willow bark for fever. She spoke in short phrases, but never unkindly. Savannah listened more than he spoke, though now and then he asked a question. "Your husband," he said once, nodding toward the ring still on her finger. "Dead." "How long?" 8 months. He held her gaze a moment. "You alone." "I have my daughter." "Dangerous." "I know." He said nothing more, and neither did she. Each day, his strength returned a little more. He sat up without wincing. He helped her gather firewood when no one could see. He repaired a broken hinge on the barn door using a bent nail and a leather strap from his moccasin. She watched him from the kitchen window, how quiet he moved, how he walked like part of the earth instead of across it. One afternoon, the neighbor stopped by. Ephraim Keller was a broad man with tobacco-stained teeth and a hat always 2 sizes too small. He brought salt and questions, both unwelcome. "Strange tracks near my fence line," he said, rocking on his heels. "You seen anything out of place, Sophie?" "No," she said too quickly. His eyes narrowed. "Don't reckon you'd tell me if you had. Not your way, is it?" She offered a thin smile. "If it was a bear, I'd have shot it. If it was a man, he's long gone." Keller grunted. "You keep to yourself too much. Makes folks nervous." "I keep to myself because folks like their opinions louder than their prayers." That earned her a glare, but he left with no more words. That night, Sophie went to the barn after Elsie had gone to sleep. Savannah was sitting up, threading twine through a broken boot. "You're strong enough to travel," she said. "I know. Then you'll need to go. Soon." He looked up. "You afraid? I have a child." He nodded. "You think I kill?" She hesitated. "I don't know what to think." Savannah set down the boot. "When I was boy, I watched men burn our winter food. They laughed. Took ears as trophies. I never forget." Sophie felt her throat tighten. "And now, I hunt. I defend. I run. I don't forget. But I don't hate." She stepped forward slowly. Were you part of the raid?" 8 months ago." Savannah didn't blink. "I was there." The words dropped into the barn like snow off a high branch. Sophie felt her knees weaken. She gripped the stall post. "My husband," she whispered. Savanu's gaze didn't waver. "He shot first. He hit my cousin. I pulled him off his horse. I did not know his name. I did not know he was yours." Her hands trembled. "You killed him." "I stopped him." "Yes." A terrible silence swelled between them. Sophie turned away, breath shallow, the lantern flickering shadows on the old wood. The truth lay there, cold and solid as the earth. "I should let you die," she said. "You still can." She turned back. His eyes met hers, not begging, not proud, simply honest. "I don't want you to die," she said, and hated herself for meaning it. She left without another word. 3 days passed. Savanu stayed in the barn. Sophie brought food but said nothing. Elsie drew him pictures and left them beside the bread. He left her feathers in return, one blue, one white, one striped like a shadowed sky. Then, one morning, Elsie asked, "Is he leaving?" Sophie didn't answer right away. "If he goes, will he die?" Elsie pressed. Sophie knelt beside her daughter and touched her cheek. "He might, but he can't stay." Elsie nodded. "I liked him. I know. I think he liked us." Sophie kissed her forehead. People can like each other and still have to walk away. That evening, she returned to the barn and found Savanu packing what little he had. "You're ready," she said. "Yes." "Do you have a place?" "West. Maybe." She reached into her coat and handed him a compass. It had belonged to Stephen. She wasn't sure why she gave it to him, only that she couldn't keep it anymore. Savanu looked at it, then her. "Thank you." She swallowed hard. "For what it's worth. I don't hate you. I know." He paused, then reached into his pouch and pulled out a small carving, a hawk, wings spread. "For her," he said. Sophie took it. He left just before sunrise. No goodbyes. Just footprints in the snow, leading west through the timber. She watched him disappear into the pines, the wind curling around her like a question half answered. Back inside, Elsie found the hawk and held it close. "Is he gone?" she asked. Sophie nodded. The girl said nothing more. She just traced the wooden wings with her fingers. Outside, the snow began to melt. Just a little. Enough to show bare ground beneath. Enough to make a mother wonder what spring might bring. The winter deepened. The kind of deep that took your breath if you stepped outside without warning. Frost climbed the windows like ivy made of glass. The well's edge froze over, and Sophie had to crack it each morning with the back of an axe. Snow stacked on the porch roof in thick, soundless heaps, pressing the world into silence. It was the season where even the birds gave up singing. She kept the barn swept, out of habit more than necessity. The hay bales had dwindled. The hens laid fewer eggs now, and even the rooster seemed quieter. The days blurred together. Fire, kettle, stitching, breath. There was something about January that made time lose its shape. A loop of small chores and long shadows. Grief curled tighter in those days, no longer sharp but heavy. Elsie read more often now. She would curl beneath the quilt with her boots still on, book pressed to her knees, tracing the words aloud in a soft murmur. Sophie liked to listen from the kitchen. The child's voice made the cabin feel less hollow, like her words wove the logs together tighter. But no matter how she tried to hold time steady, it slipped. And one morning, while gathering kindling behind the barn, Sophie saw something that made her breath still. Footprints. Fresh, narrow, deliberate. They led away from the woodshed, curved past the fence line, and vanished into the brush near the creek. She followed them, heart tight in her throat. At first, she thought he'd returned for something he left behind. But the tracks were lighter than Savanu's, narrower, too. Not a man's. And they circled, doubled back on themselves. Whoever made them hadn't come to talk. She checked the traps on the edge of the woods. 3 had been sprung, the bait taken. One of the snares was slashed clean through. That night, she sat long after the fire had burned low, eyes on the dark pane of the window. Elsie had gone to bed early, tired from splitting kindling. But Sophie didn't sleep. She listened. Around midnight, she heard it, quiet steps, just outside the house. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the sound faded. By morning, there were no tracks. Savanu returned the next day. Sophie had just stepped out to scatter feed for the hens when she saw him at the edge of the tree line, cloaked in a blanket, body stiff from cold. He walked with a limp, left leg dragging faintly, but his head was held high. She didn't call out, just watched as he approached. When he stopped before her, snow collecting on his shoulders, she said, "I thought you were gone." "I was." "What happened?" He glanced back toward the woods. "Hunters. White." He nodded. "Did they follow you?" "No." She believed him. But not because she wanted to. Inside, she made him sit by the fire, fed him soup that tasted mostly of salt and boiled potatoes. He said little. Elsie stared at him from across the room like a child watching a ghost learn how to walk again. Later, Sophie stitched a tear in his sleeve. He sat still, barely breathing as her needle worked. "Why come back?" she asked without looking up. His answer took a long time. "I saw the firelight, and I remembered warmth." It wasn't just the cold that brought him back. She knew that. Some part of her felt it before he said anything at all. "Something's wrong," she murmured. Savanu didn't answer. That evening, Sophie found Elsie sitting on the barn ladder, her face pale. "There was a man watching us," she whispered. "From the trees." Sophie's blood ran cold. "Did he say anything?" Elsie shook her head. "He just stood there, then left." Sophie climbed the hill the next day, rifle slung across her back. She found nothing but old tracks and silence. No camp, no smoke. But the feeling lingered. The feeling of eyes just beyond her reach. When she returned, she found Savanu carving something with a piece of bone. "A man came by," she said. He paused. "Not Keller. Someone else. My daughter saw him." Savanu didn't raise his eyes. "They watch. Especially when one of us goes missing." Sophie leaned against the doorframe. "Are they yours?" "No." "Are you sure?" He set the carving down. It was the shape of a bird, wings half spread, not quite in flight, not quite at rest. "Some Comanche," he said slowly, "want revenge. Others want peace. We do not speak much anymore. Not since the killings." "And what do you want?" He looked up at her. "Not to run." She exhaled, long and quiet. "You've made that hard." "I know." She reached over, picked up the bird. "This for her." He nodded. "I think she'd like it." The weather warmed slightly as February crept closer. Not a thaw, but the kind of softness that hinted at one. The creek ran thinner under the ice. The sky was no longer always gray. Sometimes it leaned blue, like a memory trying to resurface. Savanu began to help around the homestead more. Quietly, without asking. He fixed a broken rung on the porch steps, sharpened the axe, repaired a fence post with nothing but wire, patience, and a piece of rope. When Sophie caught him smoothing the warped barn door with a stone, she nearly asked him why. But then she saw his hands, raw, cracked, bleeding. The kind of hands that needed to make something stay. One afternoon, while Sophie poured water for the mule, Elsie came running from the tree line. "Someone was here." Sophie turned sharply. "What do you mean?" Elsie held up a feather. Red-tipped. Blood-colored. "He left this on the fence. Like a mark." Savanu appeared beside them, silent as dusk. He took the feather from Elsie's hand, fingers tight. Sophie saw something shift in his face. Not fear. Not quite. Bad. Elsie asked softly. Savanu crouched, met her eyes. Yes. That night, he slept in the barn again. 3 days passed. Sophie felt the tension stretch like wire between fence posts, waiting to snap. Savanu spoke less. Elsie grew quieter. The house felt smaller, like the snow pressed not only on the roof but on their chests. Then, on the 4th day, Sophie found a horse track near the creek. Just one. No rider in sight. No other signs. But it hadn't been there the day before. She brought it up over supper. "They're waiting," Savanu said. "For what?" "For you to turn me in. Or let me die." "I'm not doing either." "They don't know that." Sophie stirred the stew without looking at him. "Maybe you should leave again." "I can't keep running." She stood. "Then what do you want me to do?" His eyes were steady. "I want you to listen." So she did. He told her about the raid again, this time slower, with more detail. About how Stephen McKenna had fired the first shot. How Savanu's cousin fell from his horse, screaming. How he'd seen a man run toward him with a rifle raised. How he hadn't aimed to kill, just to stop. How it happened fast, the way violence always does. "He died in the snow," Savanu said quietly. "He was angry. Drunk. Not afraid." Sophie's hands trembled on the pot handle. "I wasn't trying to take him from you," Savanu added. "He was already gone," she said, and surprised herself with the truth of it. Later that night, after Elsie had fallen asleep, Sophie stepped outside and looked up at the stars. They blinked cold above her, sharp as ice shards, scattered across the heavens. Savanu stood behind her. "Why do you stay?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. Then, "You let me be more than what they say I am." She turned toward him. "You killed my husband." "I did. And I still want to forgive you," she whispered. "I know." It wasn't love between them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But there was something more dangerous than love. Understanding. The next morning, Sophie woke to find a hawk feather nailed to the barn door. Blood smeared beneath it. Not much. Just enough to say we know. She went inside and found the carving Savanu had made, broken in half. A warning. Not just to him. To her. To Elsie. She gripped the split wood in her hand and felt the heat rise behind her eyes. The war was not over. But maybe it had changed shape. And so had she. The wind shifted the way it does before something comes undone. Sophie felt it in her bones before she saw the smoke. Just a thin ribbon on the horizon, snaking up through the pine tops west of the ridge. It was the kind of smoke made by campfires that didn't want to be noticed, but still left a mark. She watched it for a long time, breath fogging the window, fingers pressed to the frame. Savanu noticed too. He said nothing when she brought it up. Just nodded once and went back to chopping kindling. His eyes stayed on the tree line, not the blade. It was the first time she'd seen his hands tremble since the fever. He worked slower now, cautious like the woods had grown eyes. Elsie knew something had shifted. Children always know. She spoke less. Stayed near the hearth. Her drawings changed, from birds and stars to people with no faces, stick limbs bent at strange angles. Sophie tucked them away after she slept, folding them into the drawer with her own secrets. The girl hadn't spoken of her father in weeks, not since the feather was found nailed to the barn. It was as if she understood something unspoken, that the past had begun to wake. Keller came by the next day, saddle creaking, rifle strapped across his back like a threat. His words were clumsy, smile thinner than worn-out leather. "You see any strangers passin' through?" he asked, spitting tobacco onto the frostbitten grass. Sophie stood on the porch, arms crossed, chin up. "Just the crows. They talk much. Only to fools." He didn't laugh. His gaze drifted toward the barn. "You keepin' any company out here?" "Heard rumors." Sophie didn't blink. "The only company I keep knows how to be quiet." Keller's eyes narrowed. "I'd hate to think you're protectin' one of them. After what they did." She didn't answer. Just let her silence settle like ash on his boots. He clicked his tongue, turned his horse. "Trouble's comin'." whether you believe it or not. She watched him ride away, something tightening behind her ribs. Not fear, something older. Something harder. That night, she found Savanu in the barn again, crouched beside the carving he'd repaired. He'd glued it with pine resin, sanded the break until it was nearly invisible. The hawk sat on the beam like it had never been broken at all. "He's right, you know," Savanu said without looking up. "About what?" "Trouble." Sophie leaned against the stall post. "You planning to leave again?" "Maybe. Before or after they burn the house down." Savanu looked at her then, long and quiet. "I never wanted to bring fire here." She crossed her arms. "You didn't. It was already smoldering." He nodded slowly. "You're not like them. You don't know me." "I know enough." She stepped forward, kneeling beside him. "Then tell me something true." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "The man I killed. Your husband. I remember. I see his face sometimes. Not always. Just when it's quiet." Sophie's breath caught. She thought of Stephen. The last time they'd spoken. The harshness in his voice. The way he'd slammed the door on his way to the barn, muttering about pride and cattle and what a man was owed. "I loved him," she whispered. "And I didn't." Savanu nodded. "Same with my mother. She loved my father. And feared him." A silence fell between them, gentle and painful. Sophie spoke first. "You want me to forgive you?" "No," he said. "I want you to know I'm sorry. Not for what happened, but for what it left behind." She stood slowly. "I already know." 2 days later, the sky turned gray with a weight it hadn't carried before. Snow threatened but didn't fall. The clouds just hung low and thick, pressing the world into a kind of hush. Elsie came running from the woods at dusk, her breath coming in white bursts. "Mama!" Sophie dropped the basin she was carrying. "There's a man by the creek," Elsie said. "He's watchin'. He's got something shiny. A rifle, I think." Sophie didn't hesitate. She grabbed the Winchester from above the door, checked the chamber, then knelt and looked her daughter in the eye. "You stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it unless it's me or him." Elsie's lip trembled. "You're not going alone. I'm not letting him see you." She kissed her forehead, then slipped out the back door and into the trees. Savanu was already there, crouched in the underbrush like a shadow. He didn't startle when she stepped beside him. His gaze was fixed ahead, on a figure standing at the edge of the creek, just beyond the bend. "Do you know him?" she whispered. Savanu nodded slowly. "He's one of ours. But he doesn't follow peace." "What does he want?" "Blood." Sophie's fingers tightened on the rifle. "I can end this," Savanu said. Sophie turned toward him. "How?" "By going to him. Alone. You'll die. Maybe." She hesitated, heart thudding. "What if I came too?" "You'd die first." They stared at one another in the dusklight. Then Sophie stepped back. "I won't let you go alone. You have to." "No, I don't." Savanu stood. "You saved me once. Now let me save you." Sophie wanted to argue, scream, beg. But the look in his eyes, quiet, certain, stopped her. He was not asking permission. He was telling her goodbye. She swallowed. "Don't be a martyr." "I'm not." "Then what are you?" "Done running." He stepped out into the clearing slowly, arms raised. The man by the creek turned, rifle swinging up, tension drawn tight as wire. They spoke words Sophie couldn't hear, low, sharp, the language of old wounds. The wind carried fragments, but not meaning. She only saw posture, body language. Savanu never raised his hands beyond his waist, never took a step closer than the man allowed. And then the man lowered his rifle. For a breath, Sophie thought it was over. Then he swung it like a club. Savanu didn't move fast enough. The stock cracked across his shoulder, sent him sprawling into the snow. Sophie raised her rifle before she could think. Fired once. The sound cracked the air like ice breaking on a pond. The man stumbled, caught off guard, but not struck. He turned toward her, rage written across every line of his face. And then another shot rang out. Not hers. The man dropped. Blood bloomed in the snow. Savanu rose, clutching his shoulder. Sophie ran to him, heart pounding. "Who fired?" she gasped. They turned as one. Elsie stood at the edge of the trees, Stephen's old revolver in her shaking hands. Her eyes wide, her jaw tight. "He was going to kill you," she said. Sophie's knees buckled. She wrapped her arms around her daughter and wept. Not from fear. From the sheer weight of all that had not broken them. They buried the man by the creek. No prayers, just earth and quiet. Savanu built a cairn of stones. Elsie placed a single feather on top. Then they walked back to the cabin, slow and silent, carrying not just the dead but all that death demanded. The barn burned that night. Not from malice. From necessity. They lit it together, Sophie and Savanu, as snow began to fall. It was the only way to end the trail. To silence the memory. Smoke rose into the dark sky, carrying the old ghosts with it. Sophie didn't cry. She watched the flames consume the rafters and thought of all the things she would no longer carry. Later, in the kitchen, Savanu stood with the lantern light soft on his face. "I'll go west," he said. She nodded. "You'll be safer there." He looked at her for a long time. "And you?" "I'll stay. For her. For the land." He moved closer. Not to kiss her. Just to be near. "I'm not what he was," he said. "No," she replied. "You're not." And for the first time in years, Sophie felt the ache of something not breaking, but blooming. Not love. Not yet. But something that might live through spring. The thaw came slowly, as though the earth itself had to remember how to soften. It began with a trickle, water murmuring beneath the snow crust, running secret beneath ice like a whisper finding its way into an old wound. Then came the cracking, the trees groaning as their frozen limbs bent into the promise of something warmer. By the time the barn's ashes had faded into the soil, the first green blades pushed through the dead grass behind the cabin. Sophie stood barefoot on the porch one morning, boots dangling from her fingers, steam curling from her coffee as she listened to the land breathe again. Her eyes moved over the fields, across the blackened spot where the barn had stood, now churned into dark mud by the melted snow and spring winds. She didn't mourn it anymore. That barn had held ghosts. Let the rain bury them. Inside, Elsie stirred. The girl no longer flinched at night sounds, no longer waited at the window for a face she feared would return. She moved lighter now, spoke more. Sometimes she laughed, and Sophie would pause mid-task just to hold the sound in her chest like a precious thing. There had been no more drawings of faceless men. Now it was birds again. Trees. A hawk soaring above the pines. Savanu hadn't left immediately. He lingered for a week after the shooting, after the cairn by the creek, after the barn turned to smoke and story. He helped build a new chicken run, dug a trench to direct the meltwater away from the cabin, carved Sophie a comb from walnut wood and left it on her windowsill without a word. Each morning he rose early, worked with silence, and said nothing about staying or leaving. Sophie never asked him to stay. She also never asked him to go. But on the 8th day, he saddled the old mule and packed what little he had, a compass, some dried meat, the knife he had used to carve feathers and birds. He wore no gun. Just a coat patched with care and boots so thin the mud kissed through them. Elsie hugged him before he left. A long, tight thing that made Savanu's arms stiff at first. Then he softened and held her back. When they pulled apart, she gave him the hawk carving he'd once repaired, now wrapped in one of her old scarves. "Don't forget," she whispered. "I won't." Sophie stood beside the steps, arms folded. Their eyes met, and 1,000 words passed between them. None were spoken. He nodded. She nodded back. And then he was gone. Weeks passed. Then a month. The thaw widened the creek. The fields began to green. Sophie and Elsie planted onions, cabbage, and potatoes. The nights grew warmer. The wind no longer howled, it hummed. Sophie found herself humming with it. Still, something remained unfinished in her. Not grief. Not anger. Something else. Quiet, heavy, patient. A question, maybe. A wound that had not yet closed but no longer bled. Then the letter came. It wasn't a letter in the usual sense. Just a folded piece of hide, bound with a strip of reed, delivered by a traveling tinker who claimed he'd met a Comanche boy heading west along the Bitterroot Trail. No name was given. Just a message. Inside was a drawing. A woman with her hair loose to her shoulders, a child beside her holding a bird in cupped hands. Above them, a single hawk drawn in flight, wings open, head turned back as if watching. Beneath it, in blocky English, alive, grateful, waiting. Sophie pressed the drawing to her chest. Her fingers trembled. She said nothing aloud. But later that night, when the wind blew warm through the open shutters and the moon caught the glint of the comb he had carved, she smiled. Not the polite smile she wore in town. Not the tired smile she gave Elsie when the girl asked hard questions. A true smile. The kind that curled slow and honest from somewhere deep, like a seed breaking ground. Spring bloomed in earnest after that. The cabin grew lighter. Sophie painted the shutters a pale blue, the same color as the sky on the day Savanu left. Elsie helped. They laughed through smears and splinters. The girl grew tall, all elbows and questions. She began asking about how to trap, how to stitch deeper wounds, how to read clouds. Sophie taught her. Not because she wanted her to know hardship, but because life had already shown her too much of it. The town remained what it was, quiet, watching, murmuring behind backs and under breath. No one spoke to Sophie directly about the fire, the gunshots, or the smoke that had marked the sky last winter. But she could feel their gazes. Not sharp anymore. More curious. Afraid, maybe, of how calm she looked. Keller never came back. When they crossed paths on the road once, he nodded and rode on. Some threats grow quiet when they realize their bark no longer echoes. On the first warm Sunday of May, Sophie and Elsie took the wagon to the market. The road was soft, mud thick in places, but the sky was cloudless, and bees hovered over the early flowers. Elsie wore a ribbon in her hair. Sophie wore her shawl loose, hair braided down her back. She carried herself different now. Not proud, not defiant, just rooted. At the edge of town, they stopped at the crossroads. There, growing wild where snow had once blanketed grief, were a spray of wildflowers, bright purple, golden yellow, trembling in the breeze like tiny flags of survival. Elsie hopped down first. She knelt beside the flowers, touched their stems. "I think he'd like these," she said. Sophie smiled. He would. They picked a small bundle and left them by the cairn on the hill near the creek. Not the one where the stranger had been buried, but the one they built together for Stephen, once winter had passed and memory softened into something quieter than pain. There were no words spoken there, only silence. Not a morning silence. A peace. When they returned home, the light was soft and long, draping gold across the porch. And there, sitting on the step, was a single feather, striped like a hawk. Sophie stepped forward, breath caught. She bent, picked it up. Tied to it was a carving. No. Another hawk. But this one had wings folded. Not in fear. In landing. A trail mark. One only she would understand. She turned toward the woods. Nothing stirred. No sound. Just the trees, just the wind. But she knew. He had come back. Not to knock. Not to stay. To say, "I remember." And in that moment, Sophie understood that spring was not the end of something. It was the beginning of what could now grow. She closed her eyes, feather pressed to her heart. There are some things you cannot bury in winter. Not truth. Not forgiveness. Not love. They wait. They wait beneath the snow, quiet as breath. And when the thaw comes, they rise.